Hi, I'm Dr. Utah Hamrick from Texas State University. Unfortunately, I can't be at Fredericksburg to play right now with Matt and Hank and Dan and Randy Brecker and hear all the great bands we'll be playing, but we're going to do what we can for right now, and next year look forward to seeing everybody. So if you've looked at some of the other videos, you've probably seen some great stuff from Hank and Matt and Dan, and they've really been giving you some great jazz knowledge. So I want to go in a little bit different direction just to kind of give you a little more of a bass player's perspective on soloing, on solo construction, and phrase and line construction, that kind of thing. Because I think, at least personally, I come about it a little differently than a horn player or a piano player might, just partially from my background, partially just because of the way I think about chords. Basically, I approach it in a little less of a scalar fashion than some horn players or piano players might. Partially just because that's how I think about chords. Now, if you're a functional bass player and you're playing, probably chorus after chorus, minute after minute worth of bass lines over a certain song, you know all the notes to play over a certain chord, over all the chord changes, right? You're not searching as to what you should be playing over a C minor 9 or what you should be playing over an F major 7 sharp 11. Those are all under your fingers. You've played bass lines over them. So your solo ends up not being so much about what notes do I play. It ends up being how do I put them all together in a cohesive fashion? How do I make it sound like jazz? Because if you, let's say over an F7, you'd say, well, you'd use the Mixolydian scale for that. Sure. Yep, those are all the right notes for an F7 scale. But what do you do with them? You're not just going to play them as a scale. And you can get away with that for a little bit, but eventually you have to put it into some kind of cohesive form that sounds like jazz, right? Jazz doesn't just sound like a bunch of scales, it sounds like lines that ebb and flow and have some real contour to them. Well, how do you accomplish that? Well, part of it is you can still use all those same notes you just played, all the F7 notes, into something that's a little more of a line. I'm kind of concentrating on making sure I don't play any chromatic notes for now. So now that's good. You're getting the idea there as far as that's a lot of right notes and a lot of jazz contour to your line. But how do you start kind of making it sound even more jazz-like? Where do you get some non-chord tones and some passing tones? Well, you start looking for a few places where you can do that. You can always go the kind of bebop major scale route where you play the major 6th and 7. So between the E flat and the E and the F, you have some chromaticism there. Yeah, that helps. You can do it between 5 and 6. So between C, D, and T, C sharp, and D. And then, other places between 4 and 5 if you want, though I wouldn't go overboard with that one, but it can definitely still work. So we start to build all those spots where we can. So we put all those together and we have, a lot of chromaticism that we can use over our kind of bass, no pun intended, F right there. So then it becomes, how do we make this sound more like a jazz line? We have the notes we can play of the chord, we've got some chromaticism we can use around it. So what do we have to do rhythmically? How do we construct a line that sounds like a real jazz line? Well, as with everything in jazz, not only is a big part of it listening, it's also imitation, right? Imitation, as they say, is the sincerest form of flattery, but imitation is also a great way to kind of start to get an idea of how to construct a jazz line. Nobody just instantly comes out of the, pick up their horn and starts playing Charlie Parker licks the very first time they play. It takes time to kind of figure out how to use those notes. Even if you can play every scale, how do you put them together in such a way that it sounds like a cool jazz line and not just a bunch of scales? So through imitation, we can really get an idea of that. Doing transcriptions, doing your own transcriptions, playing transcriptions, getting imitating what the greats play. One of the things that really got me going as a bass player was doing some Paul Chambers transcriptions. Paul Chambers was the bass player in the Miles Davis First Great Quintet, and actually had the longest tenure of any band member with Miles Davis pre-hiatus. He spent 8 years with him from 1955 to early 1963, and played just some fantastic solos with him, as well as the hundreds of other albums that he was on besides Miles Davis albums. But Paul Chambers had a great feel to his eighth note lines, really in a way that bebop players did back when bass players rarely played those kind of lines. So by playing through some Paul Chambers transcriptions, I started to get the feel for, this is how these lines kind of should work. And mostly what he did was a lot of what I demonstrated earlier. He played a lot of just chromatic passing tones between C, C sharp, and D, between E flat, E, and F, using those lines to kind of make the lines kind of make sense. Like his solo on The Theme, which is one of the very first solos he ever played with Miles Davis on the very first album he recorded with him in 1955 when Paul Chambers was 20. It's a rhythm changes tune. His first 8 bars are fantastic, and it's not really super complicated. It's just some nice tasty lines that work great in B flat. Yep, great line construction. A lot of D, D flat C, or C, C sharp C, depending on how you want to think about it. Some chromaticism there. Some, in bar 5 when it changes to a B flat 7, get the A flat in there. And then you start to play some good lines. So what I would do is I would play those transcriptions and then try to improvise my own lines, kind of emulating that. And that kind of evolved into a tool that I use with my students a lot, which is where you basically play 1, sometimes 2, depending on the length of the form that you're going with, is to play a chorus of a transcription and then play 2 choruses of your own improvisation. So basically you're using that chorus of transcription as the jumping off point, so you come into it, you're absorbing all those different ideas and lines and construction and how this stuff works together, and then boom, you're right into your solo, and all this stuff is still super fresh in your brain, so the rhythms and everything are still going to be there, so you can start to incorporate those into your solo pretty easily. So this is something I did a lot with these Paul Chambers solos early on, and it really helped to clarify just how to construct jazz lines, and it really demystified it too. It's like, there's not a whole lot he's not playing a bunch of crazy notes, he's not playing a bunch of crazy rhythms, he's not playing a bunch of stuff that's really hard to play. It all lays into the hand nicely and really flows, and that's pretty easy to do. I shouldn't say easy, but it really makes sense. And when something makes sense, then it becomes much easier on your instrument, as I think we can all agree on. So here's an example of me doing this in a tune called Trains Blues, which Paul Chambers plays a fantastic solo on, and I use the first 2 choruses of his solo as kind of a jumping off point. So I play 2 choruses of Paul Chambers' solo and then 3 choruses of my own to then work those ideas and phrases and style into my own solo. And you can kind of hear that, where I'll use some Paul Chambers type of ideas, even though I don't use any licks directly, but some of the things he does, which, he starts his solo with a riff. No, I don't end up copying that specifically, but it ends up being kind of a nice thing to use. This is cool, kind of blues pentatonic riff that I can use in a solo, especially to start a solo, works really well. So I kind of use that, some of his other chromatic surrounds. He really likes using that one, and it works really well. So here's a couple of examples of me doing that. I'm going to use 2 choruses of Paul Chambers, 3 choruses of improvisation, and you can hear how it kind of stylistically evolves out of that. that was a really big influence on me when I first really started getting serious about jazz bass, was this idea of playing a transcription, using that as a jumping off point for your improvisation. And like I said, I use that with my students quite frequently now. I think it's a really good tool. Another reason I like doing that is because I think that, for me personally, and I think for most bass players, as a bass player, we're very reactive players, right? What we play is we react to what's going on around us, to what's happening in the rhythm section, what's happening in the solo, and what the lines we play really end up being based on that. I could sit here and play 27 choruses of a walking blues line, but it would be much different if I had a soloist here, or even if I was just playing with a piano player, because something they play, some rhythm or some little figure they play, will influence what I would do. I might try to play something similar back to them. I might try to do a rhythmic thing. I might, maybe go with a quick pedal point that kind of underlies what they're trying to do. All these things you don't really do in a vacuum when you're just playing note. You can play these lines over and over and over, and it's fine, but they're pretty sterile when you're just practicing them. So the same thing kind of happens when you're soloing too. I end up reacting to what the rhythm section's doing, or whoever of the rhythm section might actually be playing when I'm soloing. What I hear from the drums, what I hear from the piano, rhythmic and harmonic support they're giving me, those all influence my soloing. So just practicing soloing by itself is much harder, at least for me, because there's nothing to play off of. Because I base so much of what I play off of reacting to what other people play. And I think in general that's kind of a bass player, and in general more of a rhythm section trait, is that we're very reactive. So for that, practicing soloing without anything to react to is also kind of difficult. So this ends up being especially difficult during a time like this, when you're in your house for a long time, in your apartment, and not able to go out and not able to play with people for weeks, months, hopefully not a whole lot longer than that at a time. So using this idea of transcriptions as a jumping off point in your solo ends up being a little bit of that. You can kind of simulate that because you're kind of getting into someone else's rhythms, and you're being kind of fed these rhythms and lines that you can react to on your own. It's not perfect, but it's much better than just turning on iReal Pro and just playing with nothing to react to. So it's good for quarantine practice. It's good when you can't react to people, and it's good to kind of help get the juices flowing sometimes when they need to be jump started, really. So this next tune I'm going to try this on is a great Herbie Hancock tune called Dolphin Dance. And I've been working on the transcription of Brian Bromberg's solo on that from his album Wood, which is a fantastic solo. And Brian Bromberg is a much different kind of player than Paul Chambers. So, which means that I have to get into a totally different mindset to play in a much more modern way. And if you're not familiar with Brian Bromberg and you're a bass player, or even if you're not, you want to check him out. His upright playing is just some of the best you'll ever hear, and his recorded bass tone is wonderful. He's magic in the studio as far as making his bass sound so warm and real, and like it's right there in the room with you. It's fantastic. But his soloing is incredibly fluid, incredibly fast. It uses a lot of things that Paul Chambers doesn't do. But there couldn't be more of a stark comparison between Paul Chambers, 1950s, playing gut strings with really high action, and then Brian Bromberg, modern times, lower action steel strings, able to really execute a lot of things, including hammer-ons, pull-offs, things that were much harder in Paul Chambers' day, and he didn't really do. So these are some other kind of ways to phrase that I'm then going to kind of copy from Brian Bromberg's solo to kind of jump off into my own improvisation. So this solo is much more difficult, and I'm going to attempt to play the first chorus of it. So I'll do one chorus of Brian Bromberg's transcription on Dolphin Dance, and I'll do two of my own. And then you can definitely see that everything I'm playing is much different from what I would play on Trains Blues or to something Paul Chambers wise, but there's still a lot of similarities in the sense that there's a lot of just connecting chromatic passing tones between notes. So everything that I'm going to do here is going to sound more like Brian Bromberg and less like Paul Chambers, but then the goal ultimately, like we all do, is to take all these different things, all these different styles that we're able to play in, all these different kind of interpretations of rhythm and lines, and be able to fuse them together into your own personal texture, your own personal sound. Every one of us, our own sound is just an amalgamation of everyone else's sounds, just the way it was for everyone that we're copying. Just the way that every other jazz great had other sounds in their heads and other people that they transcribed and worked on. That we're just kind of keeping the circle going there, or expanding the circle, as it were. So here's a couple examples of me doing that on Brian Bromberg's transcription of Dolphin Dance. One chorus of transcription, 2 choruses of jumping off and getting into my own solo. So here we go. So the kind of overarching lesson with doing this is that each transcription and each artist that you transcribe and then use as the basis for your improvisation, you get slightly different interpretations of phrasing and style and rhythms. And again, you start putting all those together. Again, Brian Bromberg and Paul Chambers couldn't be more different in the way they play, but I love them both, and I try to incorporate them both into my playing and trying to come up with some kind of idea of what my sound is. Now, like I said, this is great to do with my students, and you can do this at any level, at any, however difficult or easy you want the transcription to be, or even if it's just a call and response that you do with the student where you play a 2-measure phrase, they play an easy 2-measure phrase back, and you use that as the jumping off point to then do that a couple times and then let them improvise. Again, you're just planting those seeds of rhythm and phrase construction and then letting them kind of bloom on their own from there. And again, for me, that's a really good way to practice soloing when you're not able to play with other people and you're not able to react, is to use transcriptions like this. And speaking of Brian Bromberg, I'm going to play a couple solo arrangements of his from his album Wood. His album's Wood, Wood 2, Downright Upright. You know that feeling. He's got a few where he plays just upright bass in a jazz trio or duo setting. A lot of standards in there, but his upright playing is just amazing. He's a great electric player too, and he's got a lot of smooth jazz albums where he does that, but if you've not checked out any of his acoustic jazz albums, I would highly recommend it. Just absolutely unreal playing and command of the instrument like few others ever have. But one of the things I also like about him too, and in addition to his amazing playing, is he is great at arranging tunes for solo upright bass. And I know as soon as you say solo bass that immediately half of you are running for the bathroom, because that's what you do during a bass solo. It's like, time to order a drink, time to go to the bathroom, you kind of lose track. And honestly, I know that I can't hold your attention with a lot of solo bass stuff. And it's just me here in my house playing with some tracks and things like that, so I do my best to keep it interesting. But Bromberg's solo arrangements are really interesting because he does such a good job of being able to convey rhythm and melody and harmony and all the elements of music just through the traditionally single-line instrument of the bass. Through uses of double stops and implied harmony, and all the tricks that Bach would use, like on a cello suite. It really comes up with a fully formed musical performance. Sometimes using jazz tunes, sometimes using non-traditional jazz tunes. The first one I ever learned of his that I'm going to play is the Beatles tune "Come Together," which is, I assume everyone's probably heard this tune at one time or another. You're familiar with it, and Bromberg's arrangement is really, really interesting. And then there's a short one of the Star Spangled Banner. But he usually does about 4 of these per album, and they're just amazing. Some are playable, some are bordering on unplayable because they're just that ridiculous. But here's a couple of them I'd like you to check out. close out, I'm going to play a tune by the great bass player Oscar Pettiford called Tricketism. And this was recorded in 1956 as a trio with just bass, saxophone, and guitar. And I've done this tune many times with one of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Russell Haight at Texas State, as a duo with just saxophone and bass. And it's rare among bass melody and bass melodies written by a bass player, I guess to say, because one, it's in D flat, which is not the easiest key to play in. Yeah, and two, it really moves around. It's a difficult head and not one that just where everything lays super easy, but it's a wonderful tune. It's great to play on any instrument, but playing it on bass is a lot of fun, and this is a good way to close out. So this is Oscar Pettiford's Tricketism. So this is a great way to end, and I also, again, want to say thank you to Jason Younts and to Fredericksburg High School and the Fredericksburg schools for having us at this kind of virtual jazz festival. I played at and judged the last two, or I should say the first two Fredericksburg Jazz Festivals, and they've been a joy to be a part of. Jason Younts has done a wonderful job putting this together. And of course, I was looking forward to playing with Randy Brecker, but I'll have to delay that till next year, but that'll be a ton of fun no matter when it happens. So. So to everyone out there, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for supporting jazz as always. And stay safe, and I hope to see everyone in person real soon. Thanks.